Canon almost made the perfect camera for content creators and casual shooters, but with one major flaw that could be a deal breaker for both photo and video. So let's see if this camera lives up to the hype, and make sure to stick around till the end of the video where I'm going to show you cameras that might be a better fit for you. So the Canon R10 is actually part of Canon's new mirrorless lineup. It's got a new body, a new sensor, new lenses, new everything. And this camera actually reminds me quite a lot of the Canon M50, which was a very popular camera for both casual shooters and content creators. And Canon is actually known for having stellar ergonomics and user-friendly design in all their cameras, and the Canon R10 does not disappoint. Everything feels pretty much perfect on this camera. It has two custom command dials plus a mode dial. With a separate photo shutter and video record button, you can actually record both photos and videos on manual mode in this camera, which means you don't have to split between photo and video mode with this. And two of my favorite features on this camera is one, the side articulating screen so you can see yourself, but also it's a touch screen. You can use the touch screen on the back to not only control the camera, but also manage your autofocus. You can simply tap an object or a person and it will automatically track focus to that. Although the battery in the R10 is pretty meh. It still uses the older Canon style battery, which don't last quite as long in the newer bodies. However, it's not all bad news because it does have USB Type-C charging, so you can simply use a phone power bank to charge this camera. The only thing that the R10 is really missing is a vlogging handle similar to that of the ZV-E10 or the Nikon Z30. But what really matters is what's on the inside. So let's take a look at the specs of this camera and how the photos and videos look. When it comes to photos, the Canon R10 actually has three phenomenal features that make it a great beginner camera. First of all, it has a great sensor. It's 24 megapixels, and that's plenty of resolution for any beginner or even some professionals. Plus, it has those great Canon colors. Pretty much everything looks phenomenal right out of this camera, especially when it comes to people and skin tone. This is a great fashion camera, and all of this with 14-bit RAW, which gives you a ton of flexibility with your colors and dynamic range. However, the feature that probably has most of you excited is the 15 frames per second mechanical shutter mode. This camera is easily good enough for professional sports photography, and it also does 23 frames per second in electronic shutter mode, which again is insanely fast. However, this is where you start to see the problems with the Canon R10, because in electronic shutter mode, it does not have a very fast sensor readout, which in normal terms means when something's moving by your camera really quickly, you'll actually start to see a bend in straight lines and things are going to start to look kind of warped. And the slow sensor readout problem is kind of an ongoing theme with the Canon R10. And if you're someone that either doesn't care or doesn't see it, then this is still a great action camera for sports and wildlife. However, I should mention, the R10 does not have a very big frame buffer. While it can shoot 15 frames per second, you can only get about 23 photos before this camera needs a break. And depending on how fast your SD card is, that break might be 3 seconds or 7 seconds. Now here's the thing, most of you guys don't actually need or want 15 frames per second for your camera. Most of you guys are probably shooting landscapes, portraits, or something cinematic and beautiful for yourself, and you probably only need about 5 frames per second, which is why I'm going to recommend you actually get a different Canon camera. The Canon RP is a full frame 26 megapixel sensor, which is double the sensor size of the Canon R10. With the full frame sensor, you'll actually be getting better image quality, better light gathering ability, but an overall more immersive and more cinematic image. And it's a camera that I highly recommend to photographers that are more into the creative side of photography. Boom, instant upgrade. If you do like that suggestion, make sure to stick around till the end of the video where I'll give you more ideas on cameras that might be a better fit for you. So let's finally talk about the elephant in the room. Is the Canon R10 good for video? Because a lot of people are looking at this as the next best camera for creators, content creators, YouTubers, vloggers, and well, I have a lot to say on it. Now this camera does do 4K at 24 and 30 frames per second with full HD at 60 frames per second for 2 times slow motion, and it has 120 frames per second for 5 times slow motion. And one thing that I have to say, the full HD at 120 frames per second is really sharp and detailed. In most cameras, slow motion gets a little soft and mushy, but the Canon R10 does a really good job with that slow motion video. And also, for those of you out there that also edit their own videos, this camera uses IPB codec, which isn't as good as a professional all-eye codec, but it uses IPB and IPB Lite, which is still good enough for social media. One thing that I absolutely love about this Canon R10 is the fact that it finally has 10-bit color. 10-bit color is on par with professional video cameras. So shooting with this camera, you're going to have the same flexibility in your colors as a professional camera, and you can really color grade this thing to have a stylized and professional look. However, that leads us to the last problem with the Canon R10, and that is in 4K fine mode, there's a lot, and I mean a lot, of rolling shutter. However, I don't think that's a deal breaker for everybody. If you're someone that's shooting a lot of run and gun stuff, a lot of sports stuff, something where you're shaking the camera or moving around a lot, I don't think you should get this camera. However, I do think this is a phenomenal camera for people that shoot more cinematic, more slow moving stuff where the camera isn't whipping around, because you are going to get a 10-bit image in 4K downsampled from 7K. All right, so who exactly is the Canon R10 for? For beginner photographers that just want to shoot anything and everything, fast cars, sports, landscapes, this is an amazing camera. You will pretty much be able to do anything you want with this. But for someone that's more serious about portraits, landscapes, and more cinematic work, I actually still recommend the Canon RP because of that bigger full frame sensor. And as for videos, this is a great camera for a cinematic content creator that's going to be moving their camera slowly and using that 10-bit color to do an interesting or stylized color grade. However, if that does not sound like you, I actually recommend picking up the Fuji XS10. It has a 26 megapixel APS-C size sensor with in-body stabilization, 10-bit color, 4K, pretty much everything you want from the Canon except for good autofocus. The autofocus in the XS10 is 7 out of 10, 7.5. It is getting better, but it just doesn't come close to this. Or I recommend the Nikon Z30. It's a 20 megapixel sensor, but it basically has no rolling shutter in photo or video mode, and it only shoots slightly slower at 10 frames per second. It pretty much gives you 4K, all the slow motion options, just at 10-bit color when it comes to video. So if you're not someone that's super hardcore about their video, doesn't need to do big stylized color grades, that's a really good camera, and because there's no rolling shutter, it's better suited for travel, vlogging, and something where you're on the go with a lot of camera movements.